The morning of Caleb Mercer's 25th birthday began the way every morning on the Hargrove estate began, with his hands in cold water. He was at the kitchen sink by 5:30, scrubbing the cast iron pans from the previous night's dinner, his knuckles raw from the chill that crept through the old manor's walls every November. The kitchen was enormous and beautiful, all dark wood and copper fixtures and the smell of yesterday's firewood, and none of it belonged to him. It never had. He had grown up understanding this the way other children understand gravity, not as a rule someone taught him, but as a fact the world demonstrated every single day. He worked here. He slept in the small guest cottage behind the main house. He ate what was left after the family had finished. He was 25 years old and he had never once, Joe in his entire life, sat at the main dining table as a guest. He dried his hands on a rough cotton cloth and looked out the kitchen window at the Vermont hills, still dark at that hour, and he thought, another year of this. He had no reason to believe today would be any different from any other day. He had no idea that in 4 hours a stranger would walk up the gravel drive and hand him something that would detonate every certainty he had ever held about his own life. The stranger arrived at 9:47 in the morning. Caleb was raking leaves from the east lawn when he saw the car, a dark blue sedan, older model, moving slowly up the long private driveway as if the driver was reading the house numbers, making sure he had the right place. Caleb leaned on his rake and watched. Visitors to the Hargrove estate were not unusual. Edmund Hargrove was a man of considerable standing in the Vermont community, a former county commissioner, a donor to 3 local charities, a man whose opinion was sought at town halls and whose handshake carried weight. People came to see him regularly, but this car did not have the look of a business visit or a social call. It moved too carefully. It parked not near the main entrance, but at the edge of the drive, close to where Caleb was working. The engine was cut out. A long pause. Then the driver's door opened, and an old man stepped out, late 70s, slightly stooped, wearing a heavy wool coat and carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked as old as he did. He had white hair and small wire-rimmed glasses and eyes that, when they found Caleb across the lawn, went very still. Was as if he recognized him, as if he had been looking for him for a very long time. The old man walked toward him without hesitation. His name, he said, was Walter Finn. He had been an attorney, now retired, practicing out of Burlington for 40 years before he stopped. He said Caleb's full name, Caleb Daniel Mercer, with the careful precision of a man who had been rehearsing it. He said, I knew your parents. I was their attorney. I have been holding something for you for 25 years, and I made a promise to your mother that I would deliver it on your 25th birthday and not one day before. He held out the briefcase. His hands, Caleb noticed, were trembling, not from age, but from something more specific. Something like the weight of a very long wait finally ending. Caleb stared at the briefcase. He did not take it immediately. What he said slowly, the way a person speaks when the ground beneath them has just shifted without warning. My parents died in a car accident when I was a baby. Walter Finn looked at him through the wire-rimmed glasses for a long moment. Then he said quietly and carefully, as if each word was a step onto uncertain ice. Caleb, there was no car accident. The briefcase contained 214 pages. Caleb sat in a small cottage behind the main house with the door locked and the curtains drawn, and he read every single one. There were legal documents, property deeds, land survey maps, correspondence between attorneys, court filings. There were personal letters, his mother's handwriting, his father's, pages dated from before he was born and in the months just after. Sure, there were photographs of a young couple smiling in front of a beautiful lakefront property lined with pine trees. The water silver behind them, their faces open and happy and completely unaware of what was coming. And there was a sealed letter addressed in his mother's handwriting to Caleb, when you are ready. He opened it last. He read it twice. And then he sat in the silence of his small cottage, the cottage on the estate of Edmund Hargrove, the man who had taken him in, the man he had served his entire life, the man whose shoes he polished and whose car he washed and whose lawn he raked, and he understood, with a clarity that was like ice water poured directly into his chest, exactly who Edmund Hargrove was, what Edmund Hargrove had done. and what Caleb Mercer's entire life had actually been. He did not go to dinner that evening. For the first time in 25 years, Caleb Mercer did not appear when he was needed. He sat in his cottage with the documents spread across the small wooden table and the photograph of his parents propped against the lamp and his mother's letter in his hands, and he made no sound. Through the cottage window, he could see the lights of the main house warm and golden, room by room, the Hargrove family moving through their evening. Edmund settled into his study armchair. Margaret poured her nightly glass of wine. Preston watching television with his feet on the coffee table. All of it is so ordinary. All of it so completely, catastrophically wrong. Caleb looked at the photograph of his parents' faces one more time. Then he looked at the main house. His jaw tightened. His hands, still holding his mother's letter, went very still. He had a decision to make, and it was the most important decision of his life. To understand what Caleb felt sitting in that cottage on the night of his 25th birthday, you first had to understand what his life had been. Not what he believed his life had been, but what it actually was, stripped of the story he had been told and left as bare, honest fact. Caleb had come to the Hargrove estate as an infant 14 months old, too young to form a single memory of the life before. He had been told, in the matter-of-fact way that Edmund Hargrove told everything, that his parents had been killed in a car accident on Route 9 heading out of Woodstock, Vermont, on a winter night. A patch of black ice, a guardrail, a drop into the ravine. He had been told that there were no surviving relatives, yet that Edmund had known his father distantly through community circles, and that out of Christian decency and a sense of responsibility, he had taken the orphan boy in rather than let him disappear into the foster system. Caleb had grown up believing this story completely. It was the only story he had, and Edmund had told it so calmly, so consistently, so without apparent guilt, that it had never once occurred to Caleb to question it. That was the thing about a well-constructed lie. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be the only version available. His childhood on the estate had been neither cruel nor kind in any dramatic sense. Edmund had not beaten him or starved him or locked him away. What Edmund had done was something more subtle and, in its own way, more complete. But he had simply never allowed Caleb to forget his position. There was the main house, and there was the cottage. There was the family table, and there was the kitchen counter where Caleb ate standing up when he was young, or alone in the cottage when he was older. Edmund's son Preston, 4 years older than Caleb, broad and loud and accustomed to getting everything he wanted, had made the hierarchy physical from the time they were children. He broke Caleb's toys without consequence. He took Caleb's food without apology. He addressed him not by name but as a boy until Caleb was old enough to make something flicker in Preston's eyes when the word was used, something that was almost respected, though it never became that. Caleb learned early that the way to survive in the Hargrove house was to be indispensable, invisible, and patient. He became all three with a thoroughness that would have impressed anyone who understood what it cost him. That no one on the estate fully understood was a mind of extraordinary quiet depth. He had taught himself to read at 4 using the books in Edmund's study that he was permitted to dust but not to open. He opened them anyway in the early morning hours before anyone was awake, sitting cross-legged on the study floor in the gray pre-dawn light. By the time he was 8, he had read his way through 2 shelves. By 12, he had read everything in the study twice. He had a memory that retained everything it touched. Dates, names, conversations, the specific weight of a word spoken in a specific tone. He remembered the way Edmund looked at him sometimes, in unguarded moments, a look that Caleb had never been able to name, one that he had always interpreted as some form of distant pity. He understood now, sitting in the cottage with his mother's letter in his hands, what that look had actually been. It was not a pity. It had never been a pity. It was the look of a man maintaining a fiction in the presence of the person he had wronged most. Edmund Hargrove had built his life on a particular kind of confidence. The confidence of a man who believes that wealth and reputation are sufficient armor against consequence. He was 67 years old, handsome in the architectural way of men who have always been comfortable, with silver hair and a straight back and a handshake that regional politicians still traveled to receive. He sat on the board of 2 local banks. He had a wing of the Woodstock Library named after him. He attended church every Sunday in a dark wool coat and nodded at the pastor with the serene benevolence of a man at complete peace with his God. He had raised Caleb, had spoken of it publicly on 3 occasions, at community events, as evidence of his character. Took in an orphan boy with nothing, people said of Edmund, and Edmund never corrected them. It was the most efficient lie he had ever told. Because it was never a lie he had to speak out loud. It was a lie other people told for him, willingly, because it confirmed the image they already wanted to believe. The property that had started it all was a 240-acre stretch of forested lakefront land on the eastern edge of Hargrove's existing estate. The Mercer family had owned it outright since 1987. Caleb's grandfather had purchased it. Both built a modest home on the lakefront and left it to Daniel Mercer upon his death. Daniel and Rachel had planned to expand it, build a proper home, and raise their family there. So it was spectacular land, old-growth pine forest running down to the edge of Lake Aldermere, a private dock, a meadow that turned gold in autumn. Edmund Hargrove had wanted it for 20 years before the dispute began. He had made 3 separate offers to Daniel Mercer. Each one declined. The land was not for sale. It was not a matter of money. It was a matter of what the land meant. Daniel Mercer had told Edmund this directly on the last occasion they met to discuss it, in the autumn of the year Caleb was born. Edmund nodded. He had shaken Daniel's hand. He had driven home. And then he had done something that no one, not the community, not the church, and not the library with his name on the wall, would ever have believed him capable of. The night of November 14th, 25 years ago, was cold and clear, the kind of Vermont night where the stars are visible all the way to the horizon and the frost comes early and the roads turn dangerous without warning. Daniel Mercer had driven Rachel to a dinner in Woodstock, a small celebration, friends of theirs, people who would later spend years wondering what had happened to the quiet couple who never came home. Caleb was 14 months old and had been left with a babysitter, a college girl from town named Jenny Oakes, who was 18 and responsible, and who would spend the rest of her life replaying the sequence of that evening, wondering what she could have done differently when the police arrived instead of the parents. Yet Daniel and Rachel left dinner at 10:15. They took Aldermere Road home, the same road they always took, the road that ran along the edge of their property, the road they knew as well as they knew their own kitchen. They did not make it home. Their car was found the following morning by a passing driver halfway down the embankment, off the Aldermere Road Bridge, a drop of 30 feet into the frozen creek below. The official report said black ice, loss of control, a tragic accident. Case closed in 6 days. The official report did not say what Walter Finn's briefcase contained in meticulous, devastating detail was that Daniel Mercer had contacted his attorney 4 days before his death. He had contacted Walter Finn to report that someone had been accessing his property without permission. Survey stakes had been moved. Then a boundary marker at the northern edge of the lakefront land had been repositioned utterly, carefully, by someone who understood surveying well enough to do it without obvious detection. Daniel had been suspicious enough to hire his own surveyor to verify the original boundaries. The surveyor's report was in the briefcase. The markers had been moved approximately 12 feet, in a configuration that, if unchallenged, would have legally shifted a substantial portion of the Mercer lakefront property into territory that could be claimed by the adjacent landowner. The adjacent landowner was Edmund Hargrove. Daniel had also told Walter Finn something else in that final meeting, something Walter had written down in his notes and kept for 25 years because he did not know what else to do with it. He had told Walter that Edmund Hargrove had come to see him unannounced 2 days earlier, late in the evening, and had made what Daniel described as a final offer for the land. And when Daniel refused, Edmund had said something that Daniel had repeated to Walter word for word. Daniel, I want you to think very carefully about what it means to have something and lose it, because those two things are not as different as you think. Walter Finn had not gone to the police with this information at the time. He had been a young attorney, 32 years old, new to his own practice, with a family and a mortgage, and the reasonable terror of a man about to make an accusation against one of the most powerful men in his county without a single piece of physical evidence. Daniel was dead. Rachel was dead. The police had closed the case. When Edmund Hargrove stood at their funeral with a bowed head and a donated wreath and an expression of civic sorrow. Walter had kept the files. He had moved them every time he changed offices from Burlington to Montpelier and back, from his practice to his home study, from his home study to a fireproof box that he had kept under his bed for the last 11 years. He had made a promise to himself and to the memory of Daniel and Rachel Mercer. When their child was old enough, he would give the one everything. Every document, every note, every photograph, every letter. And then the boy could decide what to do with the truth. That promise had kept Walter Finn alive in the years when he wondered if keeping it had been cowardice or wisdom. He still was not sure which. But Edmund Hargrove had discovered the existence of the baby 3 weeks after the funeral. He had assumed he admitted this in the confession that would come later in a courtroom on a winter afternoon that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. He had assumed that the infant had been with the parents in the car. When he learned otherwise, when he discovered through careful, quiet inquiry that a 14-month-old boy had been left with a babysitter on the night of November 14th and was now in temporary foster placement, he had sat with this information for 11 days. 11 days of knowing that Daniel Mercer's child existed. 11 days during which the guilt that had not appeared at the murder, had not appeared at the funeral, had not appeared in the weeks of careful public grieving finally arrived. It arrived not as remorse for what he had done, but as terror at what the child represented. A living connection, a possible future witness, a boy who would one day grow up and ask questions. Edmund Hargrove had dealt with his problems methodically his entire life. He dealt with this one the same way. He had told Margaret, his wife, cold and incurious and accustomed to accepting Edmund's decisions without examination, that they were taking in the orphan boy. Margaret had accepted this the way she accepted most things Edmund told her, without warmth, without objection, and without genuine interest in the human being involved. He had driven to the foster placement himself, signed the paperwork himself, brought the child home himself. He had settled Caleb into the cottage, a warm enough space, to dry and clean, and arranged for a woman from town to care for him in the early years. He had established the fiction of charity and Christian decency so quickly and so completely that it became, within months, the only story anyone in the community knew. The boy was Edmund's good deed, Edmund's burden, carried graciously, Edmund's evidence that beneath the powerful exterior was a generous heart. Not one person who heard the story questioned it. Not one person thought to ask, why would a man with no particular connection to the dead couple take their child in, personally, rather than leave him to the proper authorities? The answer to that question had been living in a cottage behind the main house for 25 years, raking leaves and polishing shoes and calling Edmund Hargrove, sir. Caleb had loved Edmund Hargrove. This was the fact that hurt the most, more than the anger, more than the grief, more than the cold shock of discovering that his parents had been murdered. The love was the wound beneath all the other wounds, because Caleb had not loved Edmund in the way that a servant might feel a kind of professional loyalty toward a decent employer. He had loved him the way a child loves the only parental figure they have ever known, imperfectly, guardedly, with the specific ache of a person who knows the love is not fully returned, but cannot stop offering it anyway. He had spent his childhood doing small things to earn Edmund's approval, working harder than necessary, learning the estate's routines with a thoroughness that went beyond duty, as to presenting himself cleanly and quietly and without complaint, in the hope that one day Edmund would look at him with something warmer than that unreadable, distant expression. Edmund had never given him that look, but he had also never been brutal. He had housed and fed and clothed Caleb for 25 years. He had once, when Caleb was 7 and had broken his arm falling from the old oak tree on the south lawn, driven him to the hospital himself and sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. Caleb had held on to that memory his entire life. It had felt, at 7, like proof of something. He understood now what it actually was, the minimum a man could do for a child he had made an orphan without it becoming an obvious admission of guilt. There had been one friendship in Caleb's childhood that had meant something: a boy named Marcus Webb, who lived on the neighboring property's farm, the son of a farmhand, who had appeared at the estate fence when Caleb was 9 and proposed, with the direct confidence of a child who has never been taught to doubt his own welcome, that they should be friends. They had spent 3 summers running the fields in the forest edge and the creek bed that separated the two properties, And Marcus was the only person in Caleb's early life who had treated him as simply a person, not a servant's child, not a charity case, not someone defined by his position in the Hargrove household. Marcus had moved away at 12 when his father took work in Maine, and they had lost touch with the particular cruelty that geography inflicts on childhood friendships. But Caleb had never forgotten what it felt like to be treated as an equal. It had made the contrast of his daily life on the estate sharper and more painful, and he had carried that sharpness quietly, the way he carried everything without complaint, without expression, tucked somewhere no one could see. Preston Hargrove had been the defining antagonist of Caleb's childhood and adolescence. He was 4 years older, physically larger, and possessed of a cruelty that was not hot-tempered, but calculated the cruelty of a boy who understood power dynamics early and chose to exercise them for entertainment. He had broken things that belonged to Caleb, spoken over him in conversations, taken food from his plate, literally and figuratively, for years. Most significantly, Preston had developed a habit, beginning around the time Caleb was 10, of reminding him in front of guests, in front of his parents, in front of anyone who happened to be present exactly what Caleb's position in the household was. "This is Caleb," Preston would say, with the specific inflection of a boy who has learned from his father that tone does more damage than volume. "He lives here. He's not family." Edmund had never once corrected him. Margaret had never once looked up from whatever she was doing. And Caleb had stood there, each time, and said nothing, and filed it away in the same internal place where he filed everything he was not permitted to feel. What had kept Caleb sane and what had given his inner life a texture richer than his circumstances was the land itself. The Hargrove estate was 300 acres of Vermont countryside, showing Caleb knew every inch of it with an intimacy that went beyond his job. He knew where the deer bedded in the North Woods, which section of the creek ran shallowest in August, where the oldest tree on the property stood a white oak at the forest's eastern edge, that he had sat beneath hundreds of times with his back against its bark and his eyes on the sky. He was most himself outdoors, most at peace in the physical world of seasons and weather and soil. He was good with his hands and good with growing things and good with the kind of slow, patient work that produces results over months rather than days. He had built raised garden beds on the south side of the cottage and grown vegetables there every summer since he was 16. He had repaired the stone walls along the east lawn that had been crumbling for years without being asked. The estate looked better under his care than it had under the paid groundskeeper who had retired when Caleb was 18, and whom Edmund had simply not replaced because Caleb was there and cost nothing. He had understood this transaction even then. He had accepted it, because it was the only life he knew, and the mind will find meaning in any life if given no alternative. The single time Caleb had asked Edmund directly about his parents, he was 13, and something in a school history project had made the question unavoidable. Edmund had answered with practiced ease. He had described the accident on Aldenmere Road. He had described driving past the site the morning after and feeling a calling, he said, a moral obligation, to take the boy in. He had placed his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder when he said this, a rare physical gesture, and told him that his parents had been good people, decent people, and that Caleb should honor their memory by working hard and being grateful for the life he had been given. Caleb had said thank you. He had gone back to his cottage and sat with the feeling of being told his parents were good people by a man who had no particular reason to have known them, and he had found it comforting in the thin, insufficient way that a person is comforted by whatever small warmth is available. He had not asked again. He had taken the story Edmund gave him and carried it for 12 more years, all the way to the morning of his 25th birthday, when a man in wire-rimmed glasses walked up the gravel driveway and asked him if he was Caleb Daniel Mercer, and changed everything. The morning after his birthday, Caleb did not sleep. He sat at the small table in his cottage through the full dark of the Vermont night and read the documents in Walter Finn's briefcase a second time, more slowly, with the particular focused attention of a person who knows they cannot afford to miss a single detail. The property deeds, first his grandfather's original purchase agreement, clean and clear and legal, establishing the Mercer family's ownership of the Aldenmere lakefront, land beyond any question. Then the survey reports, both the fraudulent one that showed the repositioned boundary markers in the independent survey Daniel had commissioned 4 days before his death, and showing the original boundaries and the deliberate discrepancy between them. Side by side, the two surveys told a story that needed no narration. Someone had moved those markers, someone who stood to gain from the repositioning, someone with access to the land and the knowledge to do it carefully. The land in question, even at 25-year-old valuations, was worth a substantial sum. At current Vermont lakefront property values, Caleb calculated, sitting in the cottage with his mother's letter still open beside him, it was worth somewhere between $3 and $4 million. He had spent his entire life working for free on the estate of the man who had stolen it. The personal letters were the hardest part. His mother had written to Walter Finn in the weeks before her death practical, careful letters about estate planning and the legal status of the lakefront property, letters that revealed a woman who was thorough and clear-headed and deeply protective of what her family had built. But in the last letter, dated 8 days before she died, there was a paragraph that was not about property at all. It was about fear. She wrote that Edmund Hargrove had appeared at their property twice in the past week, unannounced, at hours she described as inappropriate. She wrote that Daniel had spoken to him the second time, and the conversation had not gone well. She wrote that she felt uneasy in a way she could not fully articulate, a specific, instinctive unease that she knew sounded irrational when written down, but that she could not dismiss. She asked Walter to hold copies of all their property documents somewhere safe and separate from the originals. She asked him to keep a record of everything. She did not say why, not explicitly. She did not need to. The letter was dated 8 days before the accident on Aldenmere Road. The accident was not an accident. Caleb read the paragraph 3 times. Each time he heard his mother's voice more clearly, a voice he had never actually heard, that he was assembling from the shape of her sentences and the particular weight of her concern. It was the closest he had ever come to knowing her. He pressed his hand flat over the letter when he finished and stayed that way for a long time. There was one more document in the briefcase that Walter had not mentioned when he handed it over, tucked at the very back of the stack. Behind the survey reports, in a plain manila envelope with Caleb's name written on it in Walter's careful hand. Inside was a single page, a sworn affidavit, signed by Walter Finn and notarized, dated 3 years after the deaths. It stated that on the night of November 14th, Walter had received a phone call at 11:20 p.m. from Daniel Mercer. The call lasted 4 minutes. Daniel had told him he was driving home on Aldenmere Road. He had told him that a vehicle had been following him since Woodstock, a dark truck, no plates visible, that had been sitting behind him for 6 miles and was now accelerating. He had told Walter to open the files if anything happened. He had sounded, Walter wrote, not panicked, but very calm, the specific calm of a man who has moved past fear into something like clarity. The call had ended without warning. Walter had tried to call back twice. There was no answer. He had driven to Aldenmere Road himself and found the scene already taped off by state police. He had gone home. He had opened a filing cabinet. He had looked at the documents he was now responsible for. And then he had spent the next 22 years deciding what kind of man he was going to be about it. The affidavit was his answer. By the time the November dawn broke gray and cold over the Vermont hills, Caleb had a complete picture. Not every detail, not the exact mechanism, not the specific evidence of Edmund's direct involvement in the car that night, but enough. The motive was documented. The threats were documented. The repositioned survey markers were documented. The phone call to Walter was documented. The timeline placed Edmund's escalating aggression against the Mercers in the weeks immediately before their deaths. It was not the kind of evidence that convicted a man in isolation, but it was the foundation of something that could. And it was 25 years of foundation, carefully preserved by a retired attorney who had spent decades being haunted by the question of whether he had waited too long. Caleb stacked the documents neatly. He returned them to the briefcase. He sat in the early morning light of his cottage on Edmund Hargrove's estate, behind Edmund Hargrove's house, where Edmund Hargrove's shoes were waiting in the mudroom to be polished, and he felt something settle inside him. Not peace, something older and quieter than peace. The particular stillness of a person who finally knows the truth and is deciding what to do with it. He had 3 choices, as he saw them. He could go to Edmund directly, confront him, Demand answers. Watch the man's face as the carefully constructed fiction of 25 years collapsed. He could go to the police with Walter's documents and let the machinery of justice decide what happened next. Or he could do nothing, put the briefcase under his bed, return to the kitchen, scrub the cast iron pans, and let Edmund Hargrove spend the rest of his comfortable life unreached by consequence. He considered the third option for less than 30 seconds before discarding it. He was Caleb Mercer, Daniel and Rachel's son, the boy the land had been meant for, the person who had been living inside a lie since before he could form memories. Doing nothing was not an option. The only question was which of the first two choices he could live with. And to answer that, he needed to look Edmund Hargrove in the face. For 3 days after his birthday, Caleb continued his duties on the estate as if nothing had changed. This required discipline that surprised even him. He swept the entrance hall. He stacked firewood along the north wall. He drove Preston to the airport on Wednesday morning. Preston was heading to Boston for a business trip. Loud and impatient in the back seat, his phone against his ear the entire 40-minute drive, never once acknowledging the man behind the wheel. Caleb watched him in the rearview mirror and thought about what Preston knew. He had spent the 3 days since the birthday turning this question over. Did Preston know? Had Edmund told his son the truth? Or had Preston grown up inside the same fiction as everyone else, simply from a position of greater comfort? He studied Preston's face in the mirror, the easy entitlement, the absence of guilt in any recognizable form, and concluded that Preston did not know. Edmund was too careful and too private a man to share something this destructive with a son he did not fully trust. Preston was Edmund's audience, not his confidant. He pulled up to the terminal, unlocked the doors. Preston climbed out without looking at him and walked through the sliding doors without a backward glance. Caleb sat in the idling car for a moment, watching the terminal's glass doors close. Then he drove back to the estate. He had called Walter Finn on the morning after his birthday. The old attorney had answered on the second ring, as if he had been expecting the call, as if he had been waiting by the phone since the moment he handed over the briefcase. Caleb had asked him one question. Was there enough in those documents to open a formal investigation? Walter had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said yes, not enough for a certain conviction, but enough to compel an investigation. The affidavit alone, combined with the survey evidence and the timeline, was sufficient for a serious detective to build a case. He had asked Walter a second question. Why had he waited 25 years? Walter's answer was long and honest and self-implicating. He had been afraid. He had been young, and Edmund had been powerful, and the evidence was circumstantial, and he had told himself, year after year, that waiting was the responsible thing, the careful thing, the thing that gave the case the best chance of justice rather than dismissal. He had told himself this so many times that it had become almost true. Almost. Caleb had listened to the old man's voice crack slightly on the last sentence and had said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You kept your promise. That matters." He heard Walter exhale 25 years of held breath, finally released. "What are you going to do?" Walter asked. Caleb had told him he wasn't sure yet. That was the truth. What no one on the estate could have known, watching Caleb move through those 3 days with his usual quiet efficiency, was the internal weather he was navigating. The anger came in waves, enormous, physical, the kind that makes a person's hands shake if they don't consciously still them. He had stilled his hands 100 times across those 3 days, gripping the handle of a broom or the steering wheel or the edge of a wheelbarrow and breathing through the wave until it passed. Beneath the anger was something raw, grief, real grief, the kind that has an object, not the abstract grief of an orphan who has never known another life, but the specific grief of a person who now knew exactly what had been stolen from him. He had parents. He had a mother who wrote careful letters and felt instinctive fear and asked her attorney to keep things safe and died on a dark road trying to get home to her baby. He had a father who refused to be pressured, who stood his ground, who shook hands with an enemy on the last day of his life, not knowing it was the last day. He had a property, and a stretch about nearest running down to a lake that he had never seen, that he was legally entitled to. that had been held from him by the very man who smiled at cameras and donated to libraries and sat in the front pew at church. The grief was almost too large to hold. Almost. There was a moment on the second day, a Thursday afternoon, Caleb clearing the gutters on the east side of the manor, when Edmund appeared below him in the garden. He had not seen Caleb yet. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, moving slowly through the dormant November garden, with the proprietary ease of a man in complete possession of his domain. His silver hair was neatly combed. His dark wool coat was pressed and clean. He paused at the stone bench near the rose beds and looked out over the lawn with an expression of deep, untroubled satisfaction. Caleb watched him from the gutter above, motionless, holding a handful of dead leaves. He looked at Edmund Hargrove's profile against the gray November sky and understood something he had not fully understood before, not from the documents, but from this moment of watching an unobserved man. Edmund had not been destroyed by guilt. He had not spent 25 years in private torment. He had built a beautiful life on top of what he had done and inhabited it completely, without cracks, without shadow. The guilt had surfaced once enough to bring a baby home from foster care, and then he had buried it so efficiently that Caleb wondered if it had ever truly existed at all. That realization, more than anything in the briefcase, was what finally clarified Caleb's decision. He called Walter Finn again that Thursday evening. Well, he told him to arrange a meeting with a detective, not call a meeting in person with the documents in hand. Walter knew a detective in the Burlington field office who had been the right kind of cop for 30 years. Patient, thorough, the kind who did not need a case to be easy in order to pursue it. His name was Ray Collier, and Walter said he had been told about the Mercer case years ago in general terms and had never forgotten it. Caleb said, "Set the meeting for Saturday." Walter asked if he was going to confront Edmund first. Caleb thought about Edmund in the garden, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the lawn he had built on someone else's grave. He thought about what a direct confrontation would accomplish. The denial, the performance, was the way Edmund would manage the moment with the practiced ease of a man who had been managing moments for decades. He thought about his mother's letter. He thought about the 4-minute phone call on Aldenmuir Road. Then he said, "No, not yet. Let the police go first. Let the law be what it's supposed to be." He said it steadily, without hesitation, and was surprised and then not surprised to find that it felt right. It felt like something his mother would have approved of. Detective Ray Collier was 54 years old, built like a man who had played football in college and kept most of it with a broad, flat face and steady brown eyes, and the specific manner of a person who has learned that patience is more useful than speed in almost every situation that matters. He met Caleb and Walter Finn at a coffee shop in Burlington on a gray Saturday morning, arriving 5 minutes early and ordering nothing until they arrived. He shook Caleb's hand with the particular care of a man who understood that the person across the table from him had been carrying something very heavy for a very short but very concentrated time. He looked at Caleb for a moment before saying anything, with the appraising directness of a detective reading a witness, and then, apparently satisfied, he sat down, opened his notepad, and said, "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning and don't leave anything out." Caleb told him everything. It took 47 minutes. Walter did not interject. This was Caleb's story to tell, and Walter knew it. Collier listened without interrupting, making notes in a small, tight handwriting, yet his expression neutral and focused throughout. When Caleb finished, Collier looked at the briefcase on the table between them and asked if he could take it. Caleb slid it across without hesitation. Collier spent a week with the documents. He called Caleb twice during that week, brief, specific calls, asking precise questions about the timeline and the property boundaries in Walter's relationship with the Mercer family. He was assembling something. Caleb could hear it in the structure of his questions building from foundation outward, the way a careful person builds anything meant to last. On the 8th day, he called to say that he had spoken with the state police cold case unit and that the Mercer deaths were being reclassified as a suspicious death investigation. He said this matter-of-factly, not as if it were an ordinary administrative development, and Caleb was grateful for the lack of drama. He needed straightforward information, not managed emotion. Collier also told him that he had reached out quietly to a forensics consultant who specialized in historic accident reconstruction and that the consultant had agreed to review the original crash report and scene photographs from 25 years ago. He said, "This is going to take time, and it's going to feel slow, and I need you to be patient and stay out of Hargrove's line of sight until we have what we need." Caleb said he understood. He hung up the phone and sat in the cottage and understood that the thing he had set in motion was now larger than himself. He was glad. The hardest part of the following weeks was the ordinary days, getting up at 5:30. Scrubbing the cast iron pans, raking the leaves that kept falling from the Vermont maples, driving Edmund to his bank meetings and his library board appointments and his Sunday church services, sitting in the car in the parking lot while Edmund moved through the community with his handshakes and his donations and his reputation intact. Caleb watched him at a distance and practiced the discipline of a person who knows something enormous that they are not yet permitted to say. He was not, he discovered, capable of hatred, not in the sustained, burning way. What he felt was more like a long, cold clarity, an understanding of exactly what had been done, by exactly whom, and what it had cost. He had stopped being angry and become something steadier and more durable. He had become a person waiting for the right moment, but which is a different thing entirely from a person who has given up. Preston returned from Boston after 10 days and immediately noticed that something was different about Caleb, though he could not have said what and would not have tried, because Preston did not invest mental energy in people he considered beneath his attention. He made one comment in passing on the morning of his return. "You've been weird." He said it over breakfast, not looking up from his phone, addressing no one in particular. Caleb said nothing. He refilled Preston's coffee cup, set the pot back on the warmer, and went out to clear the frost from the windshields of the estate vehicles. He stood in the cold morning air with the ice scraper in his hand and felt something move through him that was not amusing exactly, but was adjacent to it, the specific sensation of a person who knows that the ordinary morning they are standing in is one of the last ordinary mornings that will ever exist. Not for him, for all of them. Detective Collier called on a Thursday morning in December, 6 weeks after their first meeting. His voice was the same measured, patient voice it always was, but there was something underneath it, a controlled energy, a tension held professionally in check. He said, "We have enough to bring him in for questioning." The forensics consultant had found evidence in the original crash scene photographs that was inconsistent with a simple loss of control accident. Specifically, the pattern of the initial impact suggested the vehicle had been struck from behind before going through the guardrail. Combined with Walter's affidavit, the survey evidence, Rachel's letter, and the results of a quiet inquiry into Edmund Hargrove's financial activity in the weeks following the Mercer deaths, including a real estate transaction that quietly folded the disputed lakefront land into a holding company that Edmund controlled, they had the foundation of a serious criminal case. Collier said, "I'd like to bring him in on Friday morning. I'd like you to not be at the estate when it happens." Caleb agreed. He asked one question. After the arrest, would he be permitted to say something to Edmund? Collier was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would see what he could arrange. It was not a promise. Caleb accepted it as what it was. Caleb spent Thursday evening, his last evening on the Hargrove estate, the same way he spent most evenings. Quietly in the cottage, with no one far company but the sound of the Vermont wind working its way through the trees. He cooked himself a simple dinner of pasta, olive oil, herbs from the small garden he had maintained for 9 years. He ate at the table with his parents' photographs propped against the lamp in front of him, the photograph from the briefcase, the two of them smiling in front of the lakefront land, the pine trees behind them, the silver water of Lake Aldermere catching the light. He looked at them while he ate and talked to them in the way he had been doing since the night of his birthday, not out loud, but in the internal voice that had been developing for 3 weeks, building something like a relationship with two people from a set of documents and a photograph and a letter written in his mother's hand. And he told them what was going to happen tomorrow. He told them he had chosen the law over everything else, over confrontation, over whatever private accounting he might have extracted from Edmund in a direct encounter. He thought they would approve. His father, who had refused to be pressured, who had stood his ground through 3 declined offers, his father had believed in doing things the right way. Caleb had inherited this belief without ever knowing where it came from. Now he knew. He wrote a letter that evening, not to Edmund. He had no words for Edmund that he was ready to speak yet. He wrote to Preston. It was 2 pages, careful and clear, and it told Preston the truth about his father and about Caleb's parents and about the land and about everything that was going to happen in the morning. He did not write it out of cruelty. He wrote it because Preston, whatever else he was about to have his entire understanding of his father destroyed by strangers in a public and institutional setting. And Caleb thought even for Preston, even after everything that hearing it first from someone who had lived inside the lie deserved to come in writing, from a human being who understood what it felt like. He sealed the letter and wrote Preston's name on the front and left it on the kitchen counter of the main house when he went to leave the estate key on the hook that night, which was part of his routine and attracted no attention. He left the key. He left the letter. He walked back to the cottage. He packed one bag. It did not take long because 25 years of life on the estate had produced very few possessions that were truly his. The photographs, his mother's letter, 3 books, a change of clothes. The garden tools he left behind, neatly arranged. They belonged to the property. The property he was beginning to understand belonged to him. He thought about forgiveness that night. It was unavoidable. He was that kind of person. The kind who circles back to the hard questions rather than leaving them unanswered. He did not think he could forgive Edmund, not yet, possibly not ever. And he had decided not to feel guilty about that. Forgiveness was not a debt he owed the man who had killed his parents. It was something he might one day choose for himself, for his own peace if he found that carrying the weight of it cost more than releasing it. But that was a question for years from now, after the trial, after whatever came after the trial, after the slow, uncertain work of building a life that was actually his. Tonight he was not thinking about forgiveness. He was thinking about his parents' land, about 240 acres of Vermont pine forest running down to a lake he had never seen, about a dock his grandfather had built in a meadow that turned gold in autumn. He was thinking about standing on that dock for the first time, about what Lake Aldermere looked like at dawn. He fell asleep in the cottage for the last time with the photograph of his parents on the table beside the lamp. The light still on, the November wind moving through the trees outside, and the quiet certainty of a person who has finally found solid ground beneath their feet. Edmund Hargrove spent Thursday evening exactly as he always spent his evenings, in his study, in his armchair, with a glass of good scotch and a biography of some 19th century industrialist that he read without memorable absorption. Margaret was upstairs. The house was warm and still. He had no awareness of the briefcase that had been delivered 3 weeks earlier. He had no awareness of the meetings in Burlington, or the forensics consultant, or Detective Collier's careful, methodical construction. He had lived for 25 years without consequence, and he had come, over those years, to experience the absence of consequence as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. He went to bed at 10:15. He set his alarm for 7, as he always did. He slept well, as he almost always did. In the morning, he would be arrested. The police arrived at 7:43 in the morning. 2 vehicles, a detective's unmarked car and a marked state police cruiser, pulling up the long Hargrove driveway in the cold December light with a deliberate, unhurried authority that was its own kind of statement. Detective Collier was in the first vehicle. He had called ahead to the state police the previous day, and they had assigned 2 officers to accompany him protocol for an arrest of this kind, involving a man of Edmund Hargrove's community standing, a case 25 years old, in a county where the Hargrove name carried enough weight to make procedural precision essential. Collier was nothing if not precise. He walked to the front door of the Hargrove Manor and knocked with the same steady cadence he brought to everything. Margaret answered with a silk robe. With cold expression, wine glass already out of her hand for the first time that morning, and Collier identified himself and asked for Edmund. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, with the expression of a woman encountering something she had always suspected might arrive, but had decided was unlikely. Then she turned and called Edmund's name into the house. Her voice was flat and without particular alarm. Whatever she knew or suspected, she was not going to perform distress for the benefit of strangers. Edmund came to the door in his pressed dark slacks and a sweater, reading glasses on his forehead, still holding the biography from the previous night with a finger marking his page. He looked at Collier. He looked at the officers behind him. His face did something very specific and very controlled, a brief tightening, much so fast it was almost invisible. And then the professional smoothness of a man falling back on 67 years of managing appearances. He said with extraordinary composure, "Detective, what can I do for you?" Collier told him. He told him that the deaths of Daniel and Rachel Mercer were being investigated as a criminal matter, that evidence had been obtained that warranted his arrest, and that he had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. He said all of this in the same measured voice he used for everything. Edmund listened without interrupting. When Collier finished, Edmund looked past him out across the driveway, out across the east lawn where the frost lay white on the dead grass, and his expression shifted in a way that was hard to describe, not fear, not anger, something older than both. Then he handed the biography carefully to Margaret, who took it without expression. He allowed Collier to place the handcuffs on his wrists, wrists that had never worn handcuffs, that had signed checks and shaken hands and been photographed at charity galas for decades. He walked with the officers to the first vehicle. He did not look at the cottage behind the main house. He did not turn back to look at his property or his home or his wife standing in the doorway with a biography in her hands. He got into the car, the door closed, the vehicles moved back down the drive, and the Hargrove estate was suddenly, enormously, completely quiet. Caleb was at a diner in Woodstock when Collier called to confirm the arrest. He was sitting at a corner booth with a cup of coffee and his mother's photograph and the specific feeling of a person who has set something in motion and must now simply wait for it to arrive at its destination. He said, "Thank you." He meant it completely. He asked about the next steps, arraignment, bail, the timeline of what came after. Collier walked him through it patiently. He asked Caleb again if he wanted to be present at the station. Caleb had thought about this for 3 weeks and had made his decision. He said yes. He wanted to see Edmund, not to confront him. The law was doing that now, and the law was better equipped for it than Caleb's raw, complicated feelings. He wanted to see him for something else, for himself, for his parents, or for the specific human necessity variant of looking the truth in its actual face rather than carrying it as an abstraction. Collier arranged it. Caleb drove to Burlington. He saw Edmund in a holding room at the Burlington field office through a window, not face-to-face, which was the arrangement Collier had managed. Edmund sat at a metal table in the harsh fluorescent light that Caleb recognized from the document photographs of interrogation spaces. He was still composed, his silver hair neat, his back straight, his hands folded on the table in a posture that looked, from a distance, almost like prayer. But something was different. The professional smoothness was thinner, one. Caleb could see it from through the glass, the scaffolding showing beneath the surface the specific texture of a man whose careful construction is finally, or irreversibly in contact with something it cannot manage. Edmund looked up once at the mirrored glass and Caleb, on the other side of it, went very still. Edmund could not see him, but Caleb could see Edmund. He looked at the man who had fed him and housed him and used him and stole from him and built a public reputation as a decent human being on the grave of his parents. And he felt everything he expected to feel and several things he did not. Anger, yes. Grief, yes. And beneath those, something unexpected. A terrible human pity for a man who had spent 25 years carrying this and was now, finally, at the end of carrying it. He did not act on pity. He noticed it and turned away from the window. He walked out into the December air. He breathed. He called Walter Finn and told him it was done. Son Edmund Hargrove made a full confession 4 days after his arrest. His attorney had advised against it, but Edmund had dismissed the advice with the same quiet authority he had used to dismiss advice his entire life. He confessed to the deliberate repositioning of the survey markers on the Mercer property. He confessed to a confrontation with Daniel Mercer on the night of November 14th. He had followed them in his truck from Woodstock, he said, intending only to talk, to make one final case for the land. He confessed that the confrontation had escalated not in the way he had planned, which was to say it had not been planned at all, which was the one honest thing he had ever admitted about that night, and that he had struck their vehicle from behind on the bridge, intending to frighten them into stopping. And that the car had gone through the guardrail. He said he had not intended to kill them. His attorney, reading this statement, understood that the difference between intent and outcome was the thin edge on which Edmund's sentencing would be negotiated. But the confession itself, complete, signed, detailed, meant that there would be no trial in which Caleb Mercer would be required to sit in a courtroom and watch his parents' deaths argued over as a matter of legal ambiguity. Edmund had given him that, at least. Whether it was guilt or strategy or some final degraded form of accountability, Caleb chose to accept it as what it needed to be. Enough. Edmund Hargrove was sentenced to 22 years in prison for 2 counts of criminally negligent homicide, 1 count of fraud in connection with a property survey manipulation, and 1 count of obtaining property by deception, the last charge relating to the incorporation of the Mercer lakefront land into his holding company in the weeks following the deaths. His attorney had negotiated the charge down from second-degree murder, a negotiation that the Burlington Press reported extensively and that produced the predictable division of public opinion in the county where Edmund had been a pillar of community life for 4 decades. Some people who had admired him found themselves unable to reconcile the man they had known with the man in the courtroom. Others, perhaps more honest about human nature, found it entirely possible to hold both images simultaneously of the charming public benefactor and the man who had driven another man's car into a ravine and then taken the orphan child home as a servant. Mosh Preston Hargrove, who had read Caleb's letter 3 hours before his father's arrest, did not attend the sentencing. He had not spoken publicly. He had not spoken to Caleb. Caleb did not require him to. The lakefront property, 240 acres of pine forest and meadow on the eastern edge of what had been the Hargrove estate, running down to Lake Aldenmere, was returned to Caleb Mercer through a civil proceeding that Walter Finn navigated with the quiet thoroughness of a man completing the work of his professional life. The holding company Edmund had used was dissolved. The title was transferred. The legal costs were minimal because Edmund, in his confession, had made no attempt to contest the property claim. Caleb signed the transfer documents in Walter Finn's Burlington office on a Thursday morning in late January, 6 weeks after the arrest. Walter slid the papers across the desk, and Caleb signed each one with the particular care of a person for whom a signature is not routine but momentous. When it was done, Walter shook his hand and said, in a voice that was only slightly unsteady, "Your father would be proud of you." Caleb said, "I hope so." He meant it in the way you mean something when you are not performing for anyone, when you are simply stating a truth in its plainest form. He folded his copy of the transfer documents and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket, over his heart, and went outside into the cold January air and stood on the sidewalk in Burlington and breathed. He drove to the Aldenmere property on a Friday morning in February. The road that ran along its edge, Aldenmere Road, the road his parents had driven on the night they died, was clear and dry in the winter light, and Caleb drove it slowly, taking in the tree line, the shape of the hills, the way the property's boundary began where the old stone walls started at the roadside edge. He pulled through the overgrown entrance, a simple gap in the tree line with 2 stone pillars that his grandfather had built, their surfaces soft with decades of lichen, and drove up the unpaved track through the pine forest. He had been told the property had been maintained minimally by Edmund's holding company for years, enough to prevent structural deterioration of the small lakefront cabin, not enough to make the land look loved. He drove through the trees for half a mile, and then the forest opened and the lake was there. Why Lake Aldenmere in February is gray and frozen at its edges, dark blue at its center, a mile wide and perfectly still in the winter morning. The old dock extended from the narrow strip of beach, its boards gray and weathered but intact. The pine trees came to the water's edge on both sides, their reflections in the ice. The sky above was the specific pale blue of a cold, clear New England morning, high and vast and without a single cloud. Caleb stopped the car at the tree line and looked at it for a long time without getting out. Then he got out. He walked to the dock. He stood at its end and looked out across the water. He stood there for a long time. He thought about his mother, who had written careful letters and felt instinctive fear and loved this land enough to refuse to sell it. He thought about his father, who had stood his ground through 3 declined offers because some things are worth standing your ground for. He thought about Walter Finn, who had kept a promise for 25 years in the most human and imperfect and finally courageous way. He thought about Detective Collier, who had knocked on a door with a warrant and changed a story that had been allowed to stand for a generation. He thought briefly about Edmund sitting in a cell somewhere in Vermont. Silver hair perhaps less neatly combed now, the professional smoothness perhaps no longer sufficient armor against the particular cold of consequence arrived at last. He did not think about Edmund for long. There was too much else to look at. The lake, the forest, the dock his grandfather had built beneath his feet. The meadow, brown and dormant under the winter light, was that he knew from the photograph and that would turn gold in autumn. His land, his parents' land. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his mother's letter. He carried it everywhere now and held it without opening it, because he had read it enough times that he no longer needed to see the words to hear her voice. He held it in the cold air above the gray frozen lake and said quietly into the winter silence, "I found it. I'm here." He stood there until the cold became too much. Then he walked back to the car, started the engine, and turned the heat on full. He sat in the warmth for a moment. Then he began to make plans. He called Marcus Webb that evening. Marcus, who had moved to Portland, Maine at 12 and became a carpenter and a father of two, only answered after 3 rings with the cautious hello of someone who does not recognize a number. Caleb said his name. There was a pause. And then Marcus Webb laughed the same laugh Caleb remembered from 30 creekbed summers ago, open and uncomplicated and completely itself, and said, "Caleb Mercer, where have you been?" It was the most ordinary question in the world. It was also, depending on how you chose to answer it, the most complicated. Caleb chose the ordinary answer first, the one that said, "I'm around, I'm okay, I found some things out, I'll tell you about it sometime." Then he said he had some land in Vermont that needed a lot of work and asked if Marcus knew anything about construction. Marcus said he knew quite a bit. Caleb said, "Good." He said, "I think I'm going to build something." And he meant it in every sense the sentence could carry. The last thing Caleb did that winter before the season turned, before the construction began, before the slow, ongoing work of building a life that was actually his own, was visit his parents' graves. They were buried in a small cemetery outside Woodstock, their headstones side by side in a quiet corner under a large maple. Caleb had not known until Walter told him that they were buried here, had not known, had never been brought, had never had a chance to stand in this specific piece of ground and understand that these were the people he had come from. He came on a clear, cold morning with 2 bunches of flowers from a Woodstock shop, and he crouched in the frozen grass between the 2 stones, and he stayed there for a long time. He had no formal religion and no practiced ritual. He just talked to them out loud this time, because there was no one around and he was done with silence. He told them about the lake, about the cabin and its sound bones, about Walter and Detective Collier and what it had taken to get here. He told them that he had thought about vengeance and had chosen something harder and better. He told them he was angry and he was grieving and he was going to be both of those things for a long time yet, and that felt right. He told them he had their photograph on the table beside his bed in the cabin, and that every morning when he woke up, he looked at it before anything else. He told his father, "I stood my ground." He told his mother, "I kept your land." He placed the flowers against the base of each stone. He stood up. He brushed the frost from his knees. He walked back to his car through the cold Woodstock morning, and he drove home a word that now meant something real, something with a deed attached, something with pine trees and a frozen lake and a dock at the end of which a man could stand and look out across the water and know that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He drove home, and he did not look back.